Every farmer in the valley laughed when 13-year-old Everett spent his winters burying dead sticks in the freezing creek mud. They called it a boy's foolishness. But when the black sky unleashed the most devastating flood in a century, swallowing entire farms whole, they learned the terrifying truth about what those roots were actually holding. The earth in late October has a way of turning stubborn, holding onto the chill of the morning long after the sun has cleared the ridge. Along the low looping bends of Coldwater Creek, the mud had already stiffened into a heavy, gray paste that clung to the blade of a borrowed spade like wet cement. A 13-year-old boy does not have the weight to drive an iron shovel through that kind of ground by strength alone. He has to use his whole body, stepping hard onto the rusted shoulder of the blade, letting his lean frame do the work that his muscles cannot yet manage. Everett Crane had been out there since the first gray light had leaked through the sycamores, his breath rising in thin, ragged plumes that vanished into the damp valley air. By the time the kitchen chimney up at the main house began to breathe out its first thin trail of wood smoke, his boots were already caked past the ankles, and the skin between his thumb and forefinger had worn down to a raw, angry crimson. It was lonely work, the kind that makes the hours stretch out until they feel as wide as the county itself. The only sound was the rhythmic, sucking protest of the mud every time he pried another spadeful of earth loose from the bank. To anyone passing along the ridge road, he looked less like a boy with a plan and more like someone burying a secret. His hands, small for a boy who had just turned 13, were already mapping out the future in blisters and dirt. He did not look up when the crows began their noisy arguments in the high branches, nor did he pause to wipe the cold sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. He simply shifted his grip, aligned the spade a foot to the left of the last hole, and drove his heel down once more. By mid-morning, the first of the neighbors had spotted him. Harlan Beecham slowed his old flatbed truck to a crawl as he crossed the concrete bridge. His window rolled down just enough to let the chill in. He watched the boy lift a heavy clod of earth, his young shoulders straining against the weight of the damp soil. Harlan did not call out. People in Casey County generally minded their own business until curiosity got the better of them. But he lingered long enough to shake his head before shifting back into gear. To a practical man who measured the autumn by the yield of his barns and the weight of his cattle, a boy spending his Saturdays digging holes in a barren, flood-prone creek bank looked like a special kind of foolishness. The winter was coming in hard, the frost was already biting the clover, and there was nothing in that freezing mud worth the labor of a borrowed spade. Yet Everett remained, a solitary figure against the graying landscape, turning the earth one slow, deliberate breath at a time. The soil of the Crane farm did not belong to the family, so much as the family belonged to the soil. Since 1908, when his great-grandfather had cleared the first stubborn thicket of oak and cedar with a single mule and a broken beam plow, for generations of Cranes had left their sweat, their youth, and eventually their bones in this valley. It was a landscape of deep limestone ridges and rich, volatile bottomland that demanded a specific kind of devotion. Everett's father, Dale Crane, was a man carved from that same hard timber, fair but unyielding, measuring a day's worth by the straightness of a fence line or the steady weight of his cattle at the autumn sale. In a house that sat close to the earth, voices carried, but Everett was rarely the one making the noise. His older brother, Micah, possessed the kind of easy, booming confidence that drew people in at the county fair, his hands always full of blue ribbons and his mouth always ready with a joke. His younger sister, Lena, carried a sharp, bright intelligence that shone through her schoolbooks, marking her as the one who would eventually leave the valley for bigger rooms and paved streets. Everett, the middle son, existed in the spaces between their achievements. He was the quiet weight that kept the house anchored. While Micah won the praises of the neighbors, Everett was the one who walked the perimeter of the south pasture every Sunday morning while the rest of the county was still sleeping off the week's labor. He did not walk with a tool in his hand or a chore in his mind. He walked simply to look. He noticed the things that slipped past busier eyes. The way the old cedar post near the sinkhole was leaning 2 inches lower than it had the month before, or how the clover was coming in thinner along the eastern ridge, where the shale sat too close to the surface. He had a memory like old bark, absorbing the small daily shifts of the farm until he knew the land not as a map, but as a living, breathing entity. When a stray calf went missing, or a line of rusted barbed wire gave way under the weight of a fallen limb, Everett always found it first, tracking the trouble through the briars before anyone else had even missed the wire. He didn't brag about what he saw. He filed it away in the quiet places of his mind, understanding that the land never spoke aloud. It only dropped hints for those patient enough to look down. The turning point had arrived without ceremony during the breathless, heavy heat of July, the summer before Everett turned 13. He had been sent to stay for 2 weeks in Bourbon County with his maternal grandfather, Lester Bowen. Lester was a man who carried the history of the state's topography in the lines around his eyes. For 30 years, he had worked as a soil conservation technician for the County Extension Service, a quiet soldier in a long, unheralded war against the slow disappearance of the American topsoil. He was 74 now, his knees stiff from decades of climbing over limestone ledges and through briar patches, but his eyes remained as sharp and assessing as a hawk's. One evening, when the sun had dropped low enough to turn the dust in the lanes to gold, Lester took the boy by the shoulder and led him down to the edge of a neighbor's property, where the fence line stopped abruptly at the lip of a raw, gaping wound in the earth. They stood together on the high edge of a ruined creek bank. To Everett, it looked as though some massive, careless beast had taken a giant iron spoon to the pasture, scooping away yards of dark, fertile earth and leaving behind a vertical cliff of crumbling, gray clay. The water below ran sluggish and brown, choked with the very soil that should have been growing alfalfa 50 feet above. Lester didn't speak for a long time. He simply spat into the gorge and let his gaze rest on the exposed, dangling roots of a dying walnut tree that hung over the abyss. He looked at Everett and explained that when a bank like this begins to slide, most men think of concrete and heavy stone, trying to fight the water with brute force. But water always wins a fight against a wall, because a wall cannot move. He reached down, snapped a thin, flexible green switch from a wild bush growing near the path, and handed it to the boy. Lester told him that the secret to holding the world together wasn't rock, it was life. He spoke of the willow, explaining how its roots didn't just grow down, but outwards, lacing themselves through the dark subsoil like a living textile. A single willow along a bank becomes 1,000 tiny fingers gripping the earth from the inside out, turning loose mud into an anchor. When the great spring rises come, the water pushes, but the willow doesn't break. It bends, it slows the torrent, and it coaxes the river to leave its mud behind instead of stealing more. Everett held the green switch in his hand, feeling its strange limber strength, and for the first time, he saw the earth not just as dirt beneath his boots, but as a fragile architecture that could be healed if a man only knew how to listen to the old-timers who understood the ways of the roots. The yellow school bus smelled of diesel fuel and wet vinyl, its frame rattling over the gravel washboards of the county line as Everett rode home from his grandfather's farm. While the other boys shouted across the aisles or stared out at the passing cornfields, Everett sat with his knees pressed against the seat in front of him, his fingers turning the soft, thumbed edges of a booklet Lester had slipped into his canvas bag. The cover was printed on cheap, pale green paper that had yellowed around the margins, bearing the simple title, Streambank Stabilization Using Native Vegetation. It was published by the County Extension Service, written in the precise, unadorned language of men who spent their lives measuring the movement of water and the loss of acreage. To anyone else, it would have read like a dry technical manual, but to Everett, it was a blueprint for a quiet revolution along Coldwater Creek. He traced his finger over the neat ink diagrams of Salix nigra, the native black willow. The booklet explained the beautiful, hidden mechanics of the species with a cold clarity that felt more like poetry to the boy. Unlike the oaks and maples that dominated the high ridges, the black willow possessed an aggressive, fibrous root architecture designed specifically for survival in the shifting margin between earth and water. Its root system did not rely on a single rigid taproot. Instead, it deployed a vast, interlocking web of millions of tiny, hair-like tendrils that colonized the saturated zone within weeks of planting. It was a subterranean mesh, a living geotextile that bound the loose, independent particles of silt and clay into a singular, reinforced structure. As the bus swerved around a sharp bend, Everett read about lateral force resistance. When a creek swelled with winter rain, the water exerted a tremendous tearing pressure against the bank, acting like a horizontal blade. A solid stone wall or a rigid trunk stood against that force until the earth behind it liquefied, causing the entire structure to collapse into the current. But the willow was built to yield. Its wood was incredibly flexible, allowing the top growth to lay flat under the weight of a torrent, which actually protected the bank by smoothing out the water's flow. Beneath the surface, the dense mat of fibrous roots remained immovable, absorbing the energy of the river and anchoring the subsoil from within. Everett closed the booklet and looked out the window, visualizing the long, bare banks of his father's south pasture. He didn't see mud anymore. He saw an open canvas waiting for the roots. Nothing on a farm comes without a price, and for a 13-year-old boy, that price is measured in the salt of his own sweat. To pay for the bundles of black willow whips from the conservation nursery, Everett spent 3 brutal weeks of August in the loft of the Atchison family's hay barn. The air up there was 80 degrees hotter than the midday sun, a thick, suffocating haze of green alfalfa dust and diesel exhaust that coated the back of the throat like wool. Each square bale weighed 60 pounds, nearly 2/3 of Everett's own weight, and he had to catch them as they dropped from the elevator, stacking them tightly against the tin roof where the heat felt personal. By dusk, his arms were patterned with 100 tiny, stinging cuts from the coarse twine, and his boots were heavy with the leaden fatigue that only manual labor can bring. But when the final wagon was cleared, he had $42 folded tightly in his pocket. The order arrived in mid-October, dropped off by the mail carrier in a long burlap-wrapped cylinder that looked less like a collection of future trees and more like a bundle of dead kindling. The slender whips were barely thicker than a pencil, gray-brown and brittle-looking, showing no signs of life to the untrained eye. Everett carried the heavy bundle to the porch, where his father, Dale, was scraping the mud from his work boots with a pocket knife. Dale didn't look up immediately. He finished cleaning the heel, closed the knife with a sharp click, and then looked at the burlap package, and then at his middle son's calloused hands. Everett didn't offer a long explanation. He simply said he wanted to work the lower bank of the creek where the water always chewed into the south pasture. Dale, a man who believed that a boy's character was forged in the tasks he chose for himself, looked at the bundle for a long moment. He didn't ask what it cost or tell him it was a waste of time. He simply nodded once and said that as long as the boy's regular chores didn't suffer, the bank was his to tend. That was all the blessing Everett needed, a silent contract between 2 quiet men who understood that some lessons can only be learned by leaning into the shovel. News travels through a farming valley, like water through limestone, quiet but steady, finding every low spot until the whole community knows what you're up to before you've even finished doing it. By Monday morning, the talk at the Casey County Co-op feed store wasn't about the price of winter wheat or the weight of the market hogs. It was about the crane boy down on Coldwater Creek. Harlan Beecham sat on an overturned mineral tub by the counter, a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee cradled in his thick hands, recounting how he'd seen Everett out in the freezing mist, working that muddy bank like a man possessed. Harlan's voice carried a gentle, mocking amusement, the kind reserved for city folks who try to grow tomatoes in a bucket, or boys who haven't lived long enough to know that you can't bargain with a creek. The men around the counter chuckled, shaking their heads in unison. To them, a farm was a business of yields, and spending daylight hours planting dead-looking switches in a flood zone was a luxury only a child could afford. The skepticism followed Everett out to the dirt roads that lined the property. Later that week, old Gus Whitfield came rumbling down the lane on his high-crop tractor, the big diesel engine idling with a heavy, rhythmic thrum that shook the dry goldenrod along the ditch. He slowed the machine to a halt right where Everett was tamping down the earth around a newly placed whip. Gus leaned over the metal fender, his face lined and dark from 50 winters in the weather, and squinted down at the boy. He didn't yell, but his voice had the gravelly weight of absolute certainty when he told Everett that he was wasting his youth. He pointed a calloused finger toward the south, warning that when the spring rains came, Coldwater Creek didn't just rise. It tore through the valley like a runaway freight train. Any little stick planted there would be ripped out by the roots and washed straight down to Tennessee before the clover even had a chance to bloom. Everett stood his ground, holding his spade like a staff, and simply nodded in polite silence. It was a heavy thing for a boy to carry, the unified doubt of seasoned, pragmatic men who had worked the valley since before his father was born. But he kept his eyes on the mud, knowing that the real answer wouldn't come from words spoken in a feed store. The winter came in with a cruel, dry clarity that froze the topsoil until it cracked like gray slate. By mid-January, the valley was locked in a bitter temperature dip that turned the surface of Coldwater Creek into a brittle pane of dark ice. For Everett, the true test of the land did not arrive in the form of the weather, but through the heavy, indifferent weight of a neighbor's straying livestock. A small herd of black Angus cattle, driven by hunger and the search for shelter against the biting north wind, found a rotted cedar post along the back boundary and pushed through the loose wires. They drifted down into the creek bottom, their sharp, cloven hooves striking the frozen mud like iron mallets. To a 400-pound steer, the delicate willow whips were nothing more than dry twigs to be crushed underfoot or chewed down to the icy soil. When Everett walked the line that Sunday morning, the sight before him brought a cold lump to his throat. Nearly 3 dozen of his plantings were shattered, splintered down to the frost line, their pale inner wood exposed to the freezing air. The temporary wire fencing he had spent his weekends building was tangled in the frozen briars, trampled flat into the mud. It was the kind of sudden, senseless destruction that makes a boy want to throw down his tools and let the creek have its way. He stood there in the silent, freezing mist, his hands deep in his coat pockets, looking at the ruin of 3 months of hard labor. But a boy who learns from the soil does not stay defeated for long. That afternoon, instead of retreating to the warmth of the kitchen stove, Everett retreated to the dark, quiet sanctuary of the tobacco barn. The air inside smelled of cured leaf and old wood, so cold that his breath hung like smoke among the rafters. Working by the dim light filtering through the wall slats, he set to work with a pair of sharpening shears. He salvaged what he could from the broken tops of his original stock, cutting clean, angled segments from the living wood. He filled 4 galvanized wash tubs with water he had carried up from the ice-rimmed creek, thawing it by the barn stove just enough to let the cuttings breathe. He placed the new slips into the buckets, one by one, ensuring their nodes were submerged so they could begin the slow, invisible miracle of producing roots in the dark. It was a lonely, freezing vigil, but as he tamped the bundles into place, he understood that survival on a farm was never a straight line. It was a quiet process of mending what was broken before the spring could notice the damage. Spring did not bring a reprieve. It brought a different kind of hunger to the valley. By May, the cuttings that had survived the winter freeze began to push out their first tentative, pale green leaf clusters. But the moisture of the creek bank soon attracted a cloud of tiny, destructive invaders. A severe infestation of aphids descended upon the new growth, their microscopic mouths draining the vital sap from the tender stems until the leaves curled and blackened like ash. Everett spent his evenings after school crouching in the mud, carefully treating the fragile shoots with a mixture of soapy water and wood ash he carried down from the kitchen stove, his fingers stained dark by the residue. Some of the saplings he managed to save, but nearly a dozen withered away completely, leaving bare gaps in his ragged line of green. The trials deepened as July bled into August without a single drop of rain. The summer turned into a long, searing dry spell that baked the valley until the rich creek mud shrunk, hardened, and cracked into deep, jagged fissures that looked like shattered porcelain. Coldwater Creek itself became low and listless, retreating into a narrow, stagnant ribbon of green water that exposed the dry gravel bars. Without the moisture they craved, 2 of the largest saplings nearest the wide curve gave up entirely, their leaves turning a brittle, lifeless brown before dropping into the dust. Everett did not walk away. He spent his afternoons pulling the dead stalks and replacing them with fresh cuttings he had kept alive in the barn, pressing them twice as deep into the cracked earth and tamping the soil tight with the heavy heel of his work boot. One afternoon, his older brother Micah stopped by the bank on his way back from the machine shed, a wrench balanced casually on his shoulder. He watched in silence for a few minutes as Everett worked to save a struggling willow, then shook his head with the easy confidence of a boy who preferred working with iron over earth. Micah told him that he was wasting his energy, saying that they were just trees, and that when it came down to it, the creek was going to do whatever it wanted anyway. Nature couldn't be controlled by a row of sticks. Everett didn't offer a rebuttal. He kept his head down, leaning his full weight into the earth to tamp the soil, knowing that control wasn't the goal. He was simply trying to build a partnership with the ground beneath his feet. The second spring came to Casey County with a gentle, soaking warmth that seemed to loosen the tight grip of the past 2 seasons. It was during these quiet months that the hidden architecture of Everett's labor began to manifest. Beneath the heavy mud, where no human eye could witness the transformation, the surviving black willows had finally stopped merely fighting for existence. They had begun to claim the ground. The millions of microscopic root tendrils Everett had read about in the Warren Conservation Booklet had woven themselves into a dense, unyielding fabric, anchoring the subsoil and tapping into the deep, subterranean moisture of the valley. The sticks that had once looked like discarded kindling to the neighbors were now grounded, vital, and transforming. By midsummer, the visual landscape along Coldwater Creek had completely shifted. The patchy, struggling saplings had given way to a thickening, ragged line of vibrant green that followed the water's edge from the old pasture gate all the way to the wide western curve. The slender branches had grown supple and strong, reaching out over the water, their long, lance-shaped leaves trailing gracefully in the current whenever the afternoon breeze swept down from the ridges. The trees had ceased to look like a boy's experimental project. They had become a natural feature of the farm, blending seamlessly into the wild growth of the bottomland. Even the color of the bank had changed, as the dense root mats stabilized the soil enough for wild clover and native orchard grass to take hold in the spaces between the trunks. The raw, crumbling gray clay that had defined the creek for a generation was now shielded by a living architecture of green and gold. Travelers passing along the High Ridge Road still didn't understand the science behind it, but they no longer pointed and laughed at the boy with the spade. The willows had established their presence, whispering softly in the summer heat, their quiet growth a testament to a patience that the rest of the busy valley was only beginning to recognize. The weather in the valley has a memory of its own, a tendency to balance a long absence of rain with a sudden, overwhelming abundance. The late summer drought had baked the hillsides until they were the color of old ash, leaving the topsoil parched and vulnerable. Then, in the second week of October, the sky forgot its mercy. It didn't begin with a dramatic thunderstorm or a sudden gale. It started with a low leaden ceiling of slate-gray clouds that settled over the ridges and began to drop a steady, relentless gray rain. It was a kind of precipitation that didn't bounce off the earth but soaked directly into it, hour after hour, day after day, until the ground reached its absolute limit and could not hold another drop. By the 7th consecutive day, the valley was completely saturated, turning every tractor path into a canal and every low pasture into a shallow, mirrored lake. An uneasy quiet fell over the local wildlife, a collective instinct that signaled a major shift in the lowlands. Everett was the first to notice the subtle movements. The killdeer, those small vocal shorebirds that had spent the summer nesting in the gravel bars along the edge of Coldwater Creek, abandoned their traditional feeding grounds. 3 days before the worst of the weather arrived, they moved uphill in small, nervous flocks, their shrill, piercing cries echoing across the high cornfields as they sought safety on the high ground. The muskrats had stopped working on their bank burrows, and even the crows had fallen silent, roosting high in the ridgetop oaks far above the valley floor. On the 10th evening, as the rain continued its unyielding rhythm, Everett walked down to the willow line alone. The water had already swallowed the gravel bars and was creeping up the lower bank, running deep, fast, and thick with brown silt. He stepped through the standing water and placed his hand against the trunk of one of the black willows he had planted 2 winters before. The wood didn't feel like a tree anymore. It felt alive with a terrifying, mechanical tension. Beneath his palm, the trunk was vibrating with a high, steady hum, pulsing like a tightly strung steel cable under a tremendous load. The aggressive, fibrous root system was locked in a physical battle with the lateral force of the rising river. gripping the subsoil from within, while the swollen current pushed against the top growth with thousands of pounds of pressure. Everett stood there in the downpour, his coat soaked through, feeling the raw energy of that subterranean struggle, and knowing that the true test of his grandfather's wisdom had finally arrived. The climax arrived on a Thursday night under a darkness, so absolute it felt as though the valley had been erased from the map. Inside the Crane farmhouse, the sound of the rain was no longer a steady drumming. It had grown into a deafening, metallic roar that vibrated through the rafters and filled every room with a relentless, pounding static. The family sat around the oak kitchen table for supper, but nobody was eating much. The usual evening chatter, Micah's jokes about school or Lena's questions about her books, had been completely swallowed by the weight of the storm. They ate in a tense, watchful silence, their eyes darting toward the windows every time a heavy gust of wind rattled the glass. Dale Crane kept his gaze fixed on his plate, his fork turning his food over and over, his ears tuned to the changing pitch of the weather outside. He knew what that sound meant for the low pastures, for the winter hay, and for the boundaries they had spent generations defending against the water. By 8 o'clock, the nature of the sound changed. Beneath the roar of the rain on the tin roof, a new, deeper vibration began to shake the valley floor, a low guttural growl that sounded like a heavy freight train moving through the timber. It was the sound of Coldwater Creek reaching its breaking point. Across Casey County, the saturated earth could no longer contain the volume, and with a violent, tearing force, the creek jumped its banks. The transformation was terrifying in its speed. The water didn't just spill over the margins. It burst through the low spots with a lateral force that snapped fence posts and lifted heavy logs like twigs. In the pitch black of the bottomland, the river became a roaming, unpredictable predator, carving new channels through old fields and swallowing everything in its path. From the porch, Everett could see nothing through the sheet of rain, but he could hear the violent snapping of branches and the dull, heavy thuds of debris colliding in the dark. The creek was reclaiming the valley, unleashing a decade's worth of built-up fury against the fragile structures of men, and there was nothing anyone could do but wait out the dark and see what remained when the sky finally cleared. The dawn that broke on Friday morning carried a cold, pale clarity that felt almost indifferent to the ruin it revealed. The rain had finally tapered off to a thin, listless mist, leaving the valley exposed under a flat slate sky. When the farmers of Casey County stepped out of their homes, they didn't find their familiar pastures. They found a disaster zone of gray mud and shattered timber. The road connecting the low farms was completely submerged under a sluggish, brown lake, choked with floating cornstalks, broken pallets, and the bloated carcasses of drowned wildlife. Neighbors gathered along the high ridges in small, silent groups, their boots sinking into the saturated sod as they surveyed a landscape that had been violently rewritten in less than 12 hours. The destruction was personal, measured not in statistics, but in the hard labor of lifetimes. A mile down the road, old Gus Whitfield stood at the edge of his north pasture, his face looking as gray and weathered as his old tractor. The creek had torn through his boundary with a savage lateral force, shearing away 60 feet of prime bottomland as cleanly as a knife cutting through cake. Where his favorite clover field had been the day before, there was now only a raw, vertical cliff of crumbling mud and a yawning abyss of rushing brown water. His woven wire fence, which he had spent an entire spring stretching by hand, was gone, its heavy corner posts ripped from the earth and carried miles downstream. Further east, the tragedy deepened on the Dinkins farm. Rufus Dinkins, a man who had spent 12 painstaking years building up the organic matter of his low meadow through careful crop rotation and expensive lime treatments, stood with his hands deep in his pockets, staring at nothing. The floodwaters had swept across his flat ground like a broom, peeling away the dark, fertile topsoil in thick sheets, and leaving behind a barren expanse of worthless, gray river gravel and exposed yellow clay. 12 years of careful stewardship had dissolved into the brown torrent in a single night. Rufus didn't curse or yell. He simply stood there in the damp chill, a practical man staring at the sudden, absolute erasure of his life's work, learning the hard truth that when the valley floor liquefies, it takes a man's future right along with it. But when the men walked down to the boundary line of the Crane farm, The silence that fell over them was of a completely different quality. There were no raw cliffs here, no gaping wounds of exposed yellow clay, and no missing acres. Where the neighboring properties had succumbed to the tearing lateral pressure of the flood, the long stretch of the Crane Bank had remained exactly where it had stood since 1908. The river had risen just as high, and the brown current had pushed just as savagely against the south pasture. But when the water finally retreated, it revealed a quiet miracle of natural engineering. The bank was muddy, coated in a thick layer of fine river silt, but its structural integrity was entirely unbroken. The reason lay just beneath the surface, where the black willows had spent 2 years building their quiet empire. The aggressive, fibrous root systems had intertwined so densely that they formed a vast, subterranean shield, a living geotextile that functioned like an underground net. Millions of microscopic tendrils had bound the independent particles of soil into a singular, reinforced mass that refused to liquefy or peel away under pressure. Where the current had managed to scour away the very top layer of grass, it didn't find weak earth. It met the smooth, dense mat of the willow roots, exposed in places like thick, gray muscles gripping the bank, holding the structure together from the inside out. Above ground, the trees themselves showed the marks of the battle, but they had won it through the beautiful science of yielding. Unlike Gus Whitfield's rigid oaks or heavy timber posts that had stood against the torrent until they snapped, Everett's willows had simply bent. Their supple, flexible wood had allowed the top growth to lay flat under the weight of the thousands of pounds of rushing water, creating a smooth, protective green carpet over the mud that actually cushioned the bank from the river's scouring friction. As the flood levels dropped, the resilient branches had simply sprung back upright, their long, mud-slicked leaves trailing in the slowing current like green ribbons. The channel had not shifted an inch, and the precious, dark topsoil of the south pasture behind them remained perfectly intact, anchored firmly in place by a 13-year-old boy's patience and the invisible strength of the roots. A farming community is a world that moves through observation rather than speeches. It is a culture where a man's worth is judged by what his hands can produce and what his land can prove, and where the most powerful arguments are never spoken aloud, they are witnessed. On Monday morning, old Gus Whitfield came walking across the boundary line onto the Crane farm, his heavy leather boots still caked with the dark, dried mud of his own ruined north pasture. He didn't come with the booming voice he usually used at the feed store. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride, his eyes fixed on the stable, unyielding edge of the creek bank where Everett's willows stood green and upright against the current. He found the boy working near the old pasture gate, clearing a tangle of river debris from the fence line with a pair of leather gloves. Gus didn't make a grand apology, and he didn't mention the time he had compared the willow whips to useless broom handles. Instead, he simply stopped at the edge of the bank, pushed his cap back on his forehead, and looked down at the dense, intertwined mat of roots that had saved the soil. He stood there in silence for a long time, a practical old farmer measuring the distance between what he had believed and what he was seeing with his own eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, gravelly humility. He asked Everett where he had ordered those black willow whips and how much they had cost. Everett, without a hint of triumph or pride, reached into his pocket, took out a scrap of cedar shingle, and wrote down the name and address of the conservation nursery in Bourbon County. Gus took the small piece of wood, turned it over in his calloused palm, and carefully slipped it into his flannel shirt pocket. He nodded once, a silent gesture of respect from an old-timer to a young boy, and walked back across the ridge. The language of action needs no translation. The following spring, Harlan Beecham ordered 3 bundles of his own whips, planting them along his section of the creek. The year after that, the Atchisons followed suit. No one held a meeting, and no one made an announcement. The willows simply spread across Casey County, one farm at a time, moving quietly through the valley because men had looked down, watched the earth hold, and understood that the boy had been right all along. The willows are still there along Cold Water Creek, taller now, their thick, furrowed trunks standing like ancient sentinels, where a 13-year-old boy once knelt with a borrowed spade. Their branches arch high over the water, casting deep, cool shadows across the current, while beneath the dark mud, the roots continue to go deeper with every passing season. That is not a metaphor. It is simply the practical, unyielding way a willow works. The land remembers who cared for it, and it responds not to the loud, temporary efforts of brute force, but to the quiet, persistent wisdom of those willing to work with the earth rather than against it. In the end, the soil remains the great connector of our lives, the source of our beginnings, and the final destination for everything we leave behind. Everett Crane didn't set out to prove a point to the valley. He simply chose to protect a piece of ground his family had worked for generations, recognizing that the most enduring legacies are built through patience, observation, and a deep respect for the quiet rhythms of nature. Sometimes, the things that look the most foolish to the world are the very things that hold our world together when the waters rise. If this story of quiet wisdom, generational patience, and the lasting strength of the land touched your heart today, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who appreciates the deep, true lessons of the soil. Let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. We would love to welcome you into our growing family of those who still remember what it means to care for the earth.